coming out, though.
Jeffrey
Planning to come
Stein.
out. So for those who've done this before with us, I like to unmute people at the beginning. People can say hello, but you will all be muted in a little bit. And then we will unmute as questions arise. And we'll begin promptly at 5 after the hour, whatever that hour may be for you.
Jeffrey Shine.
Yeah.
I remember you.
I remember you, Carol Kessner.
Yes.
This is why we open it up now, and this is why we close it off.
Please, we're talking about 25 years ago.
Someone is named Diagnostics iPad. Can we have a name? Hello.
Now that's Jane. That's up to people. Don't have to share.
Hi, Jane.
Hi, Jane.
Jane.
Pardon me?
I think Diagnostics iPad is Stan Newman, right?
Okay.
Yeah, me. That's me.
All
I don't
right.
know why it says that. Hi, Jane.
Hello.
Herb, brother. So Jeffrey, I sent our
Hi,
new
Herb.
school director your Shavuos materials.
Hi.
I think West End Synagogue is well represented.
Very well. SAJ too.
Okay.
Who are the SAJers? Hello, fellow recons.
My wife, Deborah, says hi. She's listening, but not visible.
Yeah.
Hi, Carol. Herb.
Where did I just get that?
Oh, Herbie.
Hi, Herb.
Herbie, yeah.
How are you?
Herbie Weller.
Yes, indeed.
That's Herb Weller.
He's Weller than most of
Malcolmina.
us.
Hi, Malcolmina.
And Jane, do you remember Tar Butt?
Oh my God. Herb and I in 1997 helped build a church in one of the churches that had been burned down in Georgia, Millen, Georgia. And I, who am scared of heights, got on the 3rd level of, what do you call those?
Ladder?
Not a ladder, the scaffolding. And we did the wiring for the chandelier. I couldn't believe it. We had such a good time.
Yes, indeed.
And my daughter and those of the group who were very adventurous got up on the roof to put the tiles on, and they were called tar butts because their bottoms got covered with tar.
Right.
Yeah, 47.
And that's where we met Linda Jum, who then became very active in the college and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, sister.
Hi, man. I'm outside.
Oh, look who
nice.
it is.
Yeah.
Gail Schuster-Bruskina.
Yeah.
And
Shalom.
hi.
From Israel.
Shalom.
Mel.
Shalom. Hi, Mel.
Is it net on?
It's a fake background,
No,
Mel.
I don't
That's
think so.
Kezaria.
Miriam
You want me to
Isaac.
resend it, or-
I want to learn how to
do that.
Oh, Miriam Isaac.
We are now
Hi,
international.
Hi, Deb.
Nice. Okay.
Hi.
You just have to upload a photograph. It's very easy.
Hi,
Hello,
Marcia.
sister-in-law.
Hello, sister-in-law.
Hello, Carol Stern.
Hello, Mel Scout. Mamie.
Hello, Mel Scout.
Hello.
Hi, Mel.
Hi, Mel.
Who is that?
Richard and Roberta.
I've moved to Berlin.
I'm having trouble getting on. I'm having trouble getting on the internet. Getting on.
It's Ann Eisenstein. There she is.
Hi, Kayla.
Who's that?
Move yourself over a little bit.
This is Aaron Ziegelman. I don't see a
I
picture.
know how to do it. I just.
How? I don't see a picture.
That's because you called in instead of clicking the link, Aaron.
I clicked the link. Where it says to join the Zoom meeting. Please
Who's
go.
got chirping birdies?
Will someone help me? I don't see a picture.
No, because you're using the phone, I think.
No, that, no, let's see. Did it down in the left hand?
With a
Joy.
You want to take part in this? Tell me when Jordana comes.
Hello, Kayla Niles.
Somebody's outside with birdies. That might be Ann Eisenstein. You have birdies in the backyard?
Sounds good. Aaron, do you see where it says video and mute down in the left-hand corner?
No, I think he's on the phone.
Oh,
Maybe, no?
I don't think so, because
He called in with the phone number. It says
I
phone.
think I see a phone.
Dan,
Turn
can
on my
you
phone.
hear me? Am I on? This is Marcia Call.
Joy?
Oh,
Okay.
What are those
I
birds?
don't know. No last name.
I don't know.
And doesn't have a picture.
Okay, we're going to begin, which means I'm about to mute everybody. You're probably all used to
Hi,
this.
Gail. Before you do that, Dan, can you tell me if I'm on? I can't tell. This is Marcia Call.
We hear you.
I see you.
Okay.
I hear bird.
Joy, Michael, you're both there.
I don't.
Joy.
I don't care.
Okay. Rachel, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, so we're going to start. Good afternoon, at least for most of you, and I'm pleased that we do cross a number of time zones. My name is Dan Cederbaum, and I have the privilege of being the executive director of the Mordechai M. Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood. And it is my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to a conversation with Rabbi Dr. Rachel Sabbath Beit Halachmi on a new Haggadah for a time of crisis, the radical 1941 Haggadah of Mordechai M. Kaplan. For those who don't yet know, the Kaplan Center was organized at the end of 2010. It's based in Evanston, Illinois, and is a not-for-profit organization devoted to the transformation of Jewish community through the dissemination and promotion of the thought and writings of Mordechai Kaplan and the advancement of the agenda of the Kaplanian approach to Judaism in the 21st century. The Kaplan Center's perspective is explicitly trans-denominational. I want to acknowledge a few people now, and of course, in doing so, I always run the risk of leaving somebody out unintentionally. But first, my Kaplan Center professional colleagues, in addition to Rachel, we have Dr. Mel Skalt, Kaplan's preeminent biographer, known to most of you, Dr. Eric Kaplan, another prominent expert on Kaplan and particularly on Reconstructionist liturgy, Rabbi Dr. Jeffrey Shine, our senior educational consultant, and as the name suggests, our resident expert on all things pedagogical. I'm also delighted to have Jane Susswine from our board of directors, and I'm not sure if Jack Wolofsky is on. I always want to welcome our honorary directors, and so far I see certainly Miriam Eisenstein, and there may be others, and Anna Eisenstein, I think, is on as well, which is great. We have three special guests. You'll hear more from them a little bit later. First, the co-editors of a later Haggadah, A Night of Questions, the current Reconstructionist Haggadah published, I believe, they'll correct me, in 2000. So we welcome Rabbi Joy Levitt and Rabbi Michael Strassfeld in their capacity as the co-editors of that current Haggadah, as well as Professor Richard Saracen from Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, whom, as many of you may know, is perhaps the foremost expert, I think, in the world on Reform Haggadot in particular, but on the Haggadah in general. So it's a particular pleasure to welcome those three professionals and scholars to our meeting this afternoon. We are delighted this afternoon that we are also streaming through the new jewishLIVE portal. So thanks to our friends Dan Liebenson and Lex Rofberg of Judaism Unbound fame for that and for all of their good work. Rachel is also teaching Torah for a time of pandemic regularly online. She'll maybe say a word about that. I believe it's on Monday mornings. Looking ahead, we'll take a week off for Pesach, but On Sunday, April 19th, Jeffrey Shine will be doing a very interesting presentation with his wife, Deborah Shine, on the Omer and Shavuot and family education. We'll also be doing at least one program on Kaplan's diaries coming up. I want to turn lawyer for just a moment. We are, again, video recording and streaming this program. If you are uncomfortable with that, you are, of course, you need not stay on, or you can turn off your video. You're asking a question or otherwise speaking will be deemed to constitute consent to our recording of what you say. And speaking of recordings, almost all of our programs are or soon will be available on the Kaplan Center website. I have posted the website for those who need it in the chat section of our Zoom meeting. I've also posted my email address. That email address is, particularly for those not on the Zoom meeting but watching us online, is one of the ways to ask questions or make brief comments today. That is by emailing me at dan@kaplancenter.org. The preferred methods, as those of you who are veterans of these calls meetings know, is to chat me, preferably privately. You can do one of two things. You can either simply ask to be recognized, in which case I will do that. Please do not use the virtual raise hands function, which some people are familiar with. It's just very hard for me to keep track of that in addition to everything else. So I prefer if you would just chat me and either say, I have a question, please call on me with a name, or better yet, as has happened many times, just chat the question or brief comment and I will read it. Unlike the last couple of weeks, we will pause from time to time. Rachel's going to be in charge of this to take questions and comments as they come in, rather than holding them all for late in the call. We have blocked out 90 minutes total, so that means if you're in the East, I guess 4:30, 3:30 Central Time, etc. But we're happy to stay on. I think of it sort of like the end of a formal ending of a in-person conference or a presentation, panel presentation, where the speakers are happy to hang around a bit and answer additional questions if folks would like. So turning to our wonderful featured presenter, we've had Shaul Magid the past two Sundays, and now we have another of my favorite rabbi PhD people, Rachel Sabbath Beit Halachmi. She is one of my favorite people to work with, and I do it a lot, and for good reason. Many of you have seen her biography that we've sent around, but just I'll just touch on a few things briefly. So Rabbi Sabbath is a very well-known thought leader, institution builder, strategic innovator, a published author, and an amazing public speaker. She is completing 2 books for publication. She is, among other things, a senior fellow of the Mordechai M. Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood. She's also currently serving as the director of content for the recently launched international project, Our Common Destiny. And many of you know her from her important roles before that at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, where she was National Director of Recruitment and Admissions, an assistant professor, as well as President's Scholar. Previously, she was the Vice President of the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, where many of you probably first encountered her teaching. Rachel was ordained at HUC in New York in 1995. She's also earned a PhD in Jewish philosophy from the Jewish Theological Seminary, and she is an alumna of the Wexner Foundation Graduate Fellowship. So turning now to our, I think, very interesting topic. As early as October of 1935, the year after the publication of Kaplan's magnum opus, Judaism as a Civilization, and the year in which the publication of the Reconstructionist Journal began, Rabbis Mordechai Kaplan, Ira Eisenstein, and Eugene Cohn, joined by an important fellow traveler, namely Rabbi Milton Steinberg, began work on creating Reconstructionist liturgy. The first 3 became known famously as the Father, the Son-in-Law, and the Holy Ghostwriter. They were joined, at least for some of the work, by 2 other JTS ordained rabbis, less known to history now in this area, but they were Ben Zion Boxer and Leon Lang. one of the questions we want to look at today is, why did the Haggadah come first? In terms of Reconstructionist publications, my colleague Eric Kaplan has suggested to me, I think primarily based on long interviews he did with Rabbi Ira Eisenstein, that a version had already been in use at the SAJ. And the important, I think, thing about doing a Haggadah, as Eric points out, as opposed to a Siddur, which of course would come 4 years later in 1945, the first Reconstructionist Shabbat prayer book, is that they are designed for individual purchase, not congregational purchase, although it could be by congregation, but you didn't have to depend on congregational purchases or congregational wide agreements to use a Haggadah. In any case, the Haggadah was published in 1941 under the auspices of the newly organized Jewish Reconstructionist Foundation, which, as many of you know, was incorporated in 1940, in large measure, I think, originally to oversee publications such as this one. Just to go very briefly, as Rachel requested, before turning the mic over to her fully. Again, we have lots of experts on the call, but just to remind folks, Kaplan lived from 1881 to 1983, obviously an enormously long, rich, and productive life. He was born in a section of Lithuania, came to America when he was about 8 years old, went to City College, was ordained as a rabbi, one of the last at what we call the Old Jewish Theological Seminary, just on the cusp of Solomon Schechter's arrival between 1902 and 1903. Kaplan was ordained in 1902. He famously went to work at Kehilat Jeshurun, which remains, of course, a prominent Orthodox synagogue on the Upper East Side in New York City. He received not only Orthodox smicha, but smicha from one of the great rabbis of Eastern Europe, Yitzhak Yaakov Reines, in 1908, while on his honeymoon, which of course is a whole interesting historical episode all by itself. And then in 1934, as I just mentioned, he publishes his first real book. He's worried because he's 53 now, Judaism as a Civilization, and everything moves very quickly from then on. So with that, I will pause for a good long time and turn things over to Rachel, who I hope is unmuted.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. What a pleasure to work with you, with all of you. And some of you I've known for a very, very long time, and some of you I've worked closely with, and some of you are, as of today, new friends as we take this very interesting historical journey, which is very interesting for this particular moment, because in fact, we know that the hour in which Kaplan is thinking and creating this first set of liturgy, which of course leads to the new prayer books, etc., are coming at a time of enormous upheaval in the world, and upheaval and concern in terms of the Jewish community. In fact, the same day that, as we'll see later, the same day that that Kaplan is talking about publishing this Haggadah, he also talks about how he sees that the Jews of the world are likely to be utterly destroyed. And so it's in historical perspective, it's a very complicated thing to imagine what American Jewry knew of what was happening to the Jews of Europe at that time. But we do know that Kaplan was very much engaged in this concerns and question, and for him, the crisis that he's responding to is the decrease in connection to Judaism of American Jewry at that time. And one of the things that we'll find interesting based on the Pew study and other studies of our times is that he knew that one of the most accessible places where Jews who were affiliated, unaffiliated, or not observant in any way at that time in America, he knew that the Passover Seder was that potential place. And so with an understanding that there were decreased numbers of the celebration of Passover, he became really motivated for lots of reasons, which we can talk about. He became really motivated to actually go for that ritual in terms of one of his first and major published liturgical transformative endeavors. that it's the Passover Seder that will become an important time and an important context in which to be able to change the ways in which the Jewish community understands themselves and also understands, in fact, who they are in terms of the Jewish people and in terms of who they are in theologically, who they are for, hang on a second, I'll make sure the right thing is showing. Hopefully you're seeing a new Haggadah in a time of crisis, yeah?
I am, yes.
Okay, wonderful. So he is looking at what are the things that are actually need to change in Judaism, what views of the American Jew, and he's speaking primarily, don't forget, to a more traditional context. He's not as concerned with what's happening in other parts of the community in terms of the secular Zionist and even Reform parts of the American Jewish community at that time, which we can come back to, but he's really focused on his world, which is the observant, conservative / Jewish world of his time. And he's very concerned about the question of the Haggadah and whether or not it's speaking truthfully, ethically, spiritually, universally in the language that the Jew of his time, as he understood them, needed. And so what he did is that he actually engaged in what I think from our perspective now, being able to study lots of liturgical change, and many of you on this call are experts in this yourselves, is that he really came at really at the core issues that he felt were so problematic in Jewish life, and we'll see how he writes about them in a moment, theologically. So the new Haggadah, and you all have a link to it in the announcement for this session, and we'll link ourselves to it in a moment, but it really, in the first edition and in the second edition, in a moment we'll see, it does the following things that were very significant and very significant changes. First is that he excised most references to the 10 plagues. Second is that he eliminated a call for divine vengeance, right? Shvo chamatcha, right? Pour out your wrath on those who do not know you. We'll come back to that in a moment, and other liturgical changes. He dropped most of the Magid, most of the rabbinic interpretive sections that really are at the heart of the traditional Seder and the Seder, even as we know it today. But what's not here is that he actually really replaces it with a story of mass migration and the story of Moshe Rabbeinu, who's essentially absent from the traditional Haggadah. And he actually, he doesn't totally omit the Magid, he actually replaces it. He and of course, Eugene Cohn and Ira Eisenstein, who co-edited it with him. But of course, he definitely had the vote and the veto in the context of this kind of liturgical change. And most importantly, he actually deleted all references to the election of the Jewish people, which we'll come back to in great detail. And three other things I want to mention, and we may or may not get the chance to talk about them, is that in 1941, right, before it's clear that there's going to be a Jewish state, a sovereign Jewish state with its own national anthem, he adds Hatikva in at the end of the Haggadah, even before America. So he has this binational sense of Jewish peoplehood very clearly in place in the Haggadah. The fourth or fifth item here is that he focuses much more on universal themes about feeding the hungry and freedom for all. And lastly, he focuses on many of the new readings, which we'll see are very important for his, for what's different about this Haggadah. They're really focusing on the human condition and the personal issues and the idea of self-betterment and self-actualization. Those are very important concepts to Kaplan. And so the readings are suffused with readings about those things. So I want to highlight for us, those are actually 7 very different liturgical, theological changes. And what I have listed on this page is what he writes in his journal of that time, which is, and this is of course ironic if you know how much Kaplan had done before then, some of which Dan referred to earlier. For once, he says, I have acted out a dream of mine. So this was a fulfillment of his dream, although we know that, don't forget, before then he had, well, he published Judaism as a Civilization, The New Meanings of God, right? He's spent a couple of years in Israel. He's created the Reconstructionist, but for the Haggadah for him was a fulfillment of a dream. So those are really the 7 main issues. And as what we'll look is how he speaks about them in his diary. And then we'll look at a couple of examples from the new Haggadah itself. And then we'll pause to open for some questions. But of course, you can send them to Dan, as he said earlier. So he believes that this idea will at first grab people as maybe an idea for a second Seder. And maybe that there even should be an even additional, he's talking with an educator about creating an even more concise, limited edition that, because they may even find our revised Haggadah is still too traditional. So he's very conscious of the fact that his Haggadah, this new Haggadah, is still really fitting into the rubrics of the traditional Haggadah. And so he thinks that there's a lot of room in American society at the time for the appeal of a new Haggadah. And what happens right after it's published? The entire edition of the new Haggadah, which consisted of 3,000 copies, was sold out within 10 days after it came off the press. Last Sunday, there appeared a vicious attack on it in the Jewish Morning Journal. Come back to the various attacks later. And here's what he says. Personally, I am satisfied that this gave me an opportunity to bring out into the open the issue of the chosen people, right? That becomes one of the core liturgical change issues, ideological issues, and of course, theological issues that characterizes much of Kaplan's work in liturgy and in theology. We can have many long conversations about that. But what's fascinating is what he says in his journal here is, so he was able to bring out into the open, right, to really address it head on, this issue of the chosen people, of chosenness. And then he writes the following: it will be even harder to give up than the doctrine of revelation, although the latter is one of the 3 cardinal principles of Judaism. Right, so he finds that actually, if you think about Judaism as a whole, right, and creation, revelation, and redemption as the 3 core aspects that he's most likely referring to, the cardinal principles, that chosenness seems to be even harder for people to give up. And this becomes the source of the attack on him already with the publication of the Haggadah. And as we'll see, it becomes the core issue because of which, when he publishes the new prayer book in 1945, it becomes the core issue around which he is excommunicated, which we'll also come back to in a moment. In the meantime, another fascinating entry from the Haggadah and from the responses to it. The elimination from the Kiddush in the Haggadah, the reference to being a chosen people, has called down upon me. Wait, I want to pause here and say all of these selections from the diaries and all of the notations and all of the history behind them are with great, great thanks and a debt of enormous gratitude from all of us to Mel Scult, who for years and years has been swimming in the sea, like swimming in the sea of Talmud. Mel has been swimming in the sea of the Kaplan diaries for decades. And he has brought forth to the public view now 2 volumes of the Kaplan diaries, soon to be 3. I'm actually publishing a review. We're working on more events and reviews and publications about the 3 volumes, but I very much encourage you to read them, and you'll see how they will give you much strength, even for or especially for the hour that we're in terms of the pandemic, of a crisis, and also as we approach Passover. So back to the journal entry of April 29th, 1941. He writes, the elimination from the Kiddush in the Haggadah of the reference to our being a chosen people, which we'll look at carefully in a moment, has called down upon me the vociferous protestations of the great do-nothings who command positions of spiritual influence in Jewish life. So, in case we didn't know how he felt about those who are criticizing him, they are the great do-nothings, which actually becomes the title of a wonderful paper by Jack Wertheimer called Kaplan versus the Great Do-Nothings, about the debates around the Haggadah. You can see I have a reference to that here. So it is called down upon me the vociferous protestations of the great do-nothings who command positions of spiritual influence in Jewish life. I anticipated the storm which has broken loose and which may develop into a hurricane, right? So little does he know in 1941 that in 1945, he's going to be faced with excommunication around these issues. And here's something that Wertheimer doesn't quote. A lot of people don't quote what we go on to see here, but I think it's important, especially for this group, to be able to hear the rest of what he says. But I had to dislodge from the Jewish mentality an idea which was bound to be the most obstructive in any growth, reconstruction, and progress in Jewish life. The very act of affirming with all the solemn pretense of prayer, an idea which is not taken seriously, and which in fact is flouted and ridiculed, is the greatest offense against elemental decency. Jews could be so insensitive as to permit themselves such flummery would be evidence either of senility or degeneracy. I could not continue to work for the Jewish cause if it was to be inextricably tied up with such unfeeling disregard for the sanctity of prayer. Thank God, I have had the courage to go through with the excision of such a cancerous growth from the Jewish consciousness. I think that has certainly given us a great deal to think about and to talk about, and to be grateful to Mel about. And all of these aspects of the Haggadah, which we looked at, we'll look at more closely in a moment. But first, I want to pull up for us, and I'm going to hope that we can see it here. Are you seeing my screen hopefully with the Haggadah in front of it? Yes? Hang on. Let's try that again. Okay, do you see a Kaplan Center page? Yes?
Yep.
Wonderful. So if you look at, this is the wonderful original page. Did somebody on this screen, Dan, show us that they actually have an original version as opposed to this revised 1942?
I think so. People were sharing a little before you got on.
Okay.
But some of us have 1942, as you know, some of us have 1941.
So I just want to, if you have the 41 one, I'd love it if you showed it. I think the covers and everything are pretty much the same, correct? But what I want to look at here, oh, fantastic. What I want to look at here is if you look into the introduction about why he makes the argument of why we need this new Haggadah, right? Is that he says times have changed, right? Can you see that paragraph here on your screen? Hopefully. Times have changed. We live in a new world. We are confronted with new conditions, but the problem is still the same. The problem is how, in the face of setbacks and despite the demagogic appeals of false prophets, to keep alive in men the love of freedom and their faith in it. That is why the Pesach Haggadah has assumed once again a major role in the lives of Jews. It has a message that is fraught with power and beauty. It needs, and this is the key line here, it needs only to be transposed into a new key, into the key of modern thought, modern experiences, and modern idiom. The language and concepts of the ancient rite need to be revised so that they go straight to the minds and hearts of the men and women of today. To that extent, this Haggadah is new, And then he goes on to explain the framework. And interestingly enough, he actually doesn't talk about the 7 major changes that we discussed earlier. And of course, that became very significant. But he actually goes on to discuss what the innovations being the new, hang on a second, I just want to pull this part up, being the new readings that he's added. So if those of you who are scrolling in the, hang on a second, in the Haggadah itself, hopefully you can see what my thing is not allowing us to see, but you'll be able to see that he suggests that, I'm just going to read it to you. He suggests that the changes that have been made are actually the changes of adding new readings and of talking about some of the other issues. Among the innovations in this Haggadah is the omission of those exegetical passages contained in the traditional Haggadah, I'm quoting from the introduction, that convey no special message, and the inclusion of entirely new readings, right? The new readings are, let my people go, something that I think for those of us alive in this century, it's hard to imagine that that wasn't there from Sinai. But here he is adding it, and Pharaoh arch tyrant, the whole cycle of the Moses legends in Hebrew and English, which lend an intimate quality to the saga of a mass migration. Don't forget, in his time, he himself, but also he has lived and is leading in a time of mass Jewish migration. The verses from the Torah, which reflect the ethical implications of the Exodus, and the words and music of several additional poems. So those are some of the ways in which Kaplan himself sees the innovations that he's engaged in. And then he speaks about the translation and how he wanted to make sure it wasn't overly long, and that it was something that would be designed to attract and to hold the interest of young people, right? And so those are his main goals in this time of enormous upheaval. So I can pause now, if it's appropriate, Dan, and maybe open to some questions.
Sure. What I'm going to suggest, Rachel, it's your call. I'm able to put up the straight, not from the website, the PDF of the Haggadah anytime you want. If I do it, though, I will cut off your screen sharing. So just
no, that's fine. So let's go back to the screen that I'm sharing.
So yeah, I think first Jeffrey Shine wants to offer at least a comment. Let me unmute.
Please.
Jeffrey, I think it's a sort of general comment. Come on. Sorry, this takes a minute.
I'm unmuted now, Dan.
Oh, you are? Okay.
It had to be a partnership. You unmuting and my letting myself be unmuted. Thank you, Rachel. This is fascinating and very, very stimulating. I was struck when you mentioned the power that Kaplan attributes to Pesach and the tradition of the Seder, that he also begins, actually before, even in Judaism as civilization, he's struck by the Haggadah itself and the pedagogy of the Haggadah and the power of questions. And that is very much a guiding inspiration for what some people will be experiencing if they join my wife and I. This isn't a commercial, it's really an intellectual comment, but it is true that we are inspired by Kaplan's writing in 1972 an essay saying that an innovation that's absolutely necessary for Jewish life is the creation of the Shabbat Seder and modeled on the Pesach Seder. And it's really in that spirit that for many years, my wife Deborah and I, with family and friends, developed all sorts of Haggadot, as it were, packages of materials. And I know Gail Schuster's here, so she lived with that innovation in her own home as well. But the spirit of going back to Pesach, drawing out of its ability to engage and ask questions, is extraordinary. So we try to apply those same methodologies to reinvigorate the traditions of counting the Omer and orphaning the great orphan of the Jewish Machzor Chagim, Shavuot, which gets lost for all sorts of reasons. So, and my wife wants to add quickly. Yeah, and we've done that with our Reconstructionist congregation here. We base it on an understanding of multiple intelligences. But apropos of this, I just was struck that Kaplan's attraction and sense that Pesach can draw in ways that other holidays can't lead him further to suggest that we ought to keep experimenting and finding out what it is about Pesach and the tradition of the Seder that can continue to inspire. Thank you.
Thanks. So from our friend Abe Klott, for Rachel, what were the two other cardinal principles in addition to Revelation that you referred to?
Oh, creation, redemption, revelation are usually the three cardinal ones. And of course, Rosenzweig has 6, but I'm going to resist going into a whole class right now on Jewish thought and theology. But I do want to respond to the previous comment and also refer us all to Eric Kaplan's wonderful book, where you can find a lot of the, I hope you can see it. Can you see it? Yes.
From Ideology to Liturgy, about to be republished by Hebrew Union College.
Yes, wonderful. I know that, From Ideology to Liturgy. And he actually says something really important that I left out. There are many things we could have added to our list of 7 major things that are unique to the Haggadah, and which make it different. I want to make sure I'm showing the list here. Is that and this is in the words of Eric Kaplan, to increase the accessibility of the Haggadah, musical notation was included for its major songs, and English text was edited so that it could be understood even by children. But I want to point out that the idea of adding the simple musical notes really created a context in which he was allowing American Jewry to have full access to the music and to the main parts of the liturgy that are sung, quote unquote, traditionally. But I would say that was very significant at that time until today, when there are thousands and thousands of options of ways of, creating your own Haggadah. And of course, now that we're all on screens this Passover, it's going to be very interesting a year from now to look back. The Shana Haba'ah, those of us who engage in this are going to be able to do a whole review, liturgically speaking, of what happened in this hour of crisis. But the other thing that Eric says here in this book that I want to highlight is that the changes that Kaplan makes in the Haggadah is in a clear foreshadowing of the sensitivities that were to characterize all of Kaplan's subsequent liturgies. The concept of Israel's chosenness was removed from the festival Kiddush. Statements concerning the rebuilding of the Temple of Jerusalem and the advent of a personal Messiah were eliminated from the Birkat HaMazon. And the issue that we'll also get to, the Shvo Chamatcha passage, which calls on God to punish the nations that do not acknowledge God's sovereignty, was also removed, as were the recitation of the 10 plagues and the Dayenu verses concerning the drowning of the Egyptians in the sea, the killing of their firstborn, and the Israelites receiving their possessions, right? But one of the things that was different, and this is interesting to note, especially as we sing Dayenu and think of Dayenu differently this year, what Eric Kaplan notes is that different from Kaplan's other liturgical changes in the Dayenu, he still maintains the splitting of the Red Sea, right? Redemption, he maintains it, and the revelation of Torah at Sinai. So the fact that he's maintaining those phrases in the Dayenu actually is good background to that journal piece that we just read, right? About that giving up giving up chosenness, here he says, it will be even harder to give up chosenness, right, than the doctrine of revelation. And so we have that he is retaining actually the idea of redemption and revelation very clearly in this Haggadah through what he includes and omits from Dayenu. Go ahead, Dan. Other questions?
Yeah, well, I just want to add, and my favorite example, I just confirmed, right? Adir Hu remains as a closing song for the second part of Hallel, which is about as specific to the temple as one gets. Probably an example of the limits, although not clear there were many in terms of what one could excise in terms of the popular will, but it is, so that's the one that's always struck me.
Not to mention the Chad Gadya, which we could talk about later in terms of Kaplan's notion of the idea of evil and retribution.
Yeah.
But he says, nonetheless, let us sing this song together. And of course, he includes, we may be jumping ahead of ourselves, but L'Shana Haba'a B'Yerushalayim. And he includes the rebuilding of Zion and the redemption of Israel, at least in the revised edition. And here we have Hatikva before America, my country, 'tis of thee.
So back to take a couple more and then we'll go back to Rachel. Our friend Rabbi Robert Tabak has a comment on history. Robert, Bob, are you on?
Yes, I'm on. First, the personal comment is I grew up with, I guess it was the 1942 edition of this in the tiny Jewish community of Dubuque, Iowa, where I guess one of our Reformed student rabbis in around 1960 something had brought that, and for our family Haggadah Seder and for our synagogue Seder, which was the whole Jewish community, about 70 Jewish people. So that's what I grew up with. And before I knew there were such a thing as Reconstructionists, I knew about that Haggadah. As a historian, and this is an insight that I think I would underline the part about universalizing it, which is one of your points, Rachel. And Deborah Dash-Moore has written about this too. I just want to emphasize the timing of this is that coming out not only during the Depression, but during the period when before either Russia or the United States were in World War II, the Nazis were winning in Europe. The full scale of the Holocaust, what we call the Holocaust, was not known, but everyone knew it was very bad for Jews in Poland and other places. To write both optimistically and also to talk about people can be enslaved more ways than one, and to universalize some of these values at a time when there were, I think there were not that many texts that did that, was quite an accomplishment. And the other thing I just point out is just, I think in terms of the publishing world at that time, I'm not an expert, but from my own work on Jews, American Jews between the wars, there weren't that many kinds of Haggadahs. It's not like today. I mean, there were various versions of the Maxwell House kind of Haggadah, which is the traditional Haggadah with some English. But aside from the Reform Union Haggadah from 1920 something, there were not a huge variety of quote unquote modern Haggadahs that looked at all at in any way at taking this ancient text and applying it to a modern situation. So I put those two pieces into the accomplishments as well.
Absolutely. I just want to add there, if I can, that the Reform movement has in 1907 a Haggadah, which is much abbreviated edition, where it also limits the Maggid section. The 4 questions become 2 questions. There's no drops of wine. There's no next year in Jerusalem. In the 1923 edition, there's an engagement in some of these liturgical changes that Kaplan thinks about later, and they already add America, right? My country, 'tis of thee, to it. But it's not really, and of course there's no issue of chosenness. So just to get a historical framework, Kaplan wasn't the first one to be publishing new Haggadot, but what Eric and Dan and others can say more about, and I hope they will, is that there is no real official Haggadah at the time for the conservative movement, right? Most conservative Jews at the time are using the Silverman, or they're using traditional Haggadot. So, right, so that part of American Jewry that isn't, solidly identified as Reform or as secular Zionist, right? There is no real innovation being published in that arena at this time. Please correct me if I'm wrong about that.
That's right. Miriam Eisenstein has a question or comment. Miriam, you should be unmuted. Thank.
Yes, thank you, Dan. I just wanted to point out that in many of the songs, the old stuff is kept. And that's true in the Siddur too. That it's not strictly consistent. I don't really know what the theory behind it was, but it seems to me the things that could be characterized simply as folk songs that a lot of people knew. Original words were kept. I mean, one of the obvious one we just noticed recently was Yigdal. I mean, changed one verse of Yigdal, but all the rest of it is just as difficult in Reconstructionist terms as the Mechaye Metim that comes at the end. Why they changed one verse and left all the rest. I think what it came down to is it was very familiar. And so just left it.
Yep. No, I think this is true in all liturgy. You know more about this than I do, Rachel. There's always inconsistency. Another example on the other side is the elimination, though, speaking of folky songs, the last line of An Kelohenu, of course, is famously omitted. Right. To take out that reference to the temple. And that's why I'm always interested in leaving in Dear Who. But yes, it's as you say, I think it's a bit necessarily probably inconsistent. Eric Kaplan wanted to say a few things. Are you unmuted or did I not do that yet, Eric? And then we'll move on, Rachel, because you have more to cover. Let me unmute Eric.
Yeah.
Eric?
Okay, so just some quick, to make a couple of quick points. In the Reconstructionist Journal, in the edition of April 18th of 1941, Kaplan does publish a much more complete piece in which he describes the motivation behind the Haggadah and says a lot more about specific changes that he makes and why he makes them. And included in that is actually a statement about the Reform Haggadah and what he thinks is good about it and what he thinks that is lacking. If there's time, we can get to that at some point. In terms of the timing of why the Haggadah comes first, again, the Reconstructionist magazine is very informative there. And again, in the edition of October 7th, 1938, there's a record of the proceedings of the Summer Institute. And in those proceedings, they say that on Shabbat morning, Eugene Cohn basically ran a kind of experimental Shabbat service in which not only were some additional texts added, but some actual changes were made into the actual wording of the liturgy. And afterwards, in the afternoon, they had a conversation about it. And in that conversation, the people who were gathered there gave tremendous pushback on it. And it leads, I think it's Ira who writes this up because Kaplan is in Israel at the time. Ira writes that based on this discussion, it has been concluded that we will continue just to work with supplementary readings and not to make any changes to the actual text. And then when a year later, when they actually publish a collection of supplemental readings, the editorial there again says specifically that they're doing this instead of doing real liturgy changes because of that previous conversation. And then in terms of why there's a 45 prayer book at all, in the same article that he published, lifted up here in 41, introducing the Haggadah, in the realities and values thing, they mention that it's sold out, that it's sold to 3,000, that it has sold out to 3,000 copies. And then they write, this convinces us there's a hunger for eloquent, aesthetically pleasing, and exciting liturgy in other areas of Jewish ritual and tradition. So I think the success of the new Haggadah led them to think that there might be more of a market for the other things. If you compare the two editions, like the 41 and the 42 edition, you see that they do respond to some of the some of the critique that is given of the Haggadah, which, but I'll leave that aside for the continuation. About why the universalization, you know, that point, just quickly, I think Kaplan again has a very strong idea that the only way that the position of the Jews in the world is going to be safe is if the position of all lovers of freedom and democracy are safe. So therefore, he puts it in that broader context, which I think is one of the reasons why the Haggadah is still usable today. That's it for now. I'll retreat.
Great. So first, at least, what I hope may be multiple comments from either Rabbi Joy Levitt or Rabbi Michael Strassfeld, who are unmuted.
Sorry, it was me. Just to Miriam's earlier point about popularity, I once had a conversation with Ira about this very issue and asked him why, despite I understood the theological need to change chosenness, that in the one thing that every kid who had a bar mitzvah knew, which is the Aliyah Torah, he felt the need to change it. It was so popular, and many people were walking into synagogue and getting an Aliyah for the first time since their bar mitzvah. Why change that very popular thing? And Ira said, exactly. No one who's been in synagogue, no one who's not been in synagogue since they're 13 has the right to come up and say they're chosen.
Thank you.
That's awesome. Wait, Joy, do you still hold by that coaching?
I say Kirvanu.
I know, but the explanation for it is what I mean.
You mean, oh, do I think? Well, I actually think that the point here is that it was inconsistent. I don't know why it was inconsistent. I'm sure there was some ambivalence. I'm sure there was some wavering of courage, but I don't know that we will ever be able to find a through line that explains every single thing.
Although the closest thing we do have is the thinking of Kaplan in his journals around the time. Certainly, Dan, should I jump back in, or do we want to?
No, I'm gonna, one question which I can answer from Jack, and I apologize, no last name. He says, I assume Elijah and his cup of wine is left out. No, Eliyahu Hanavi is in. That would be, Rachel and I agreed, a subject for the advanced seminar in a few months will be the relationship between Shafo Hamatcha and Eliyahu Hanavi. For the moment, let's just say Eliyahu Hanavi, cup of Elijah and singing, is there, with one small change, which I've debated with some old-time reconstructionists for a long time. The word, for those who know the song we sing, many of us, Havdalah, Bimheira b'yameinu, speedily in our days. The word b'yameinu is dropped. So talk about subtle liturgical change. It's bimheira, but not b'yameinu. I know, although one of Kaplan's colleagues once told me it was a typo. If it was a typo, it was repeated over and over in various publications.
There's no Miriam either, Dan. No, I just want to highlight that.
No Miriam HaNeviah. No, he hadn't gotten there yet.
That comes much later. And I think
okay.
Later.
Now, one technical issue. I know, particularly for people on the phone, I apologize because if the source sheet had been available earlier, I would have posted. But that's
I'm gonna post a link to it shortly.
If we can, I can read the link or send it to anybody who would like it. I'd hate to make you talk and do that at the same time, but if you want to.
No, it's okay. What I wanted to recommend here is that we actually look at one of the liturgical changes. I realize the group who's on here, those of you who are talking, are incredibly familiar with many of the liturgical changes that happen, but not everybody is. And so I wanted to just look at this key one since it's relevant in the Haggadah, and of course it's relevant elsewhere as well. Is this question of chosenness as it appears not just in the Torah blessings as Joy referenced earlier, but how it really appears with actually with full force, if you think about it, in the Yom Tov Kiddush, and certainly if you add to that if you add to that this question of Passover, I'm just getting a link in just a second. Hang on, I'm just getting the link to put in the chat, and then you can all look at this easily with me. Is if you look at, I'll move to the sheet there in a moment. There, I put a link to it in the chat for those of you who are on Zoom. But for those of us who are looking at the documents on the screen, hopefully we still have the same document on the screen. There we go. Is that we have his kiddush here for in the new Haggadah is in the English translation of its time is preserving actually something that wasn't preserved necessarily in earlier editions of Reform and other Haggadot, is this idea of distinguishing in the Kiddush whether it was being said on Shabbat or not. But the Feast of Unleavened Bread is referred here as the season of our liberation from bondage. And the English for the Kiddush is that thou hast quickened within us the desire, right, instead of Asher Kitshanu, right, quickened within us the desire to serve, right, in joy and gladness. And I think that's a powerful way of understanding this this kiddush and this change, right? Chag HaMatzot, right? L'sasona, Chag HaMatzot hazeh, zman cheotenu mikra kodesh zecher l'yetziat Mitzrayim ki otanu keravta la'avodatecha, right? So that's where we're going to see. I think it's except for the Reconstructionist publication, Eric, correct me if I'm wrong. And obviously, don't forget the Haggadah was piloted a number of times at SAJ before it was published. But that language is appearing, right, for more Jews who are showing up at the Passover Haggadah, certainly than are showing up to SAJ or any other shul using the Kerev Tanu language at an Aliyah. So if you think about it, this is its real debut. And of course, for those who may not be familiar with how it's being changed, here's the chosenness factor that's in the traditional Kiddush of Yom Tov and other places where we would normally be stressing there that we've been chosen from among all peoples and exalted above all nations, right? Is that how it's usually translated? And we've been, and again, we say it toward the end, we've been chosen above all nations to sanctify God in this particular way. So that's a good example of the liturgical change.
Right.
We talked a little bit about the omission of Shvo Chamatcha and the omission of the 10 plagues. Before we do that, I want to just say one of the, in terms of the arguments and how it was received, one of the first responses, within a very short period of time, he gets, of course, from Professor Louis Finkelstein, his, what can I say? His partner in dialogue, his
student, first of all.
His student initially, but also his biggest and loudest critic for much of his time at the seminary. Anyway, so here's what he writes in a group letter to the faculty. This isn't just, orally or to Kaplan himself or just to the editors. The term Haggadah itself is quite a misnomer for your book. It is, if you will, a new Passover service, but a book which omits drasha, right, the Maggid section, drasha, or rabbinic interpretation of the biblical verses, has ceased to be a Haggadah. For the word Haggadah is a technical term applying to the interpretation of a biblical text. So just in case we had any concerns about what one of the first remarks about it was, but when Kaplan summarizes actually 10 days earlier in his journal what the main arguments are that he's received, is first of all, the new Haggadah is bound to have a destructive effect because it's being issued by someone of such great influence in Jewish life, right? And then he of course, his comeback is, as many of you might imagine, there are plenty of other less wise people who have as much greater influence who are doing nothing, right? Who don't put their views out into the open, and at least he's being honest and being influential. And then, of course, there's the concern that if you have a new Haggadah, as we always hear about new liturgy, you're bound to create anarchy, right? And there'll be no end to the anarchy. The third main argument is that it will, Jewish unity will suffer. And of course, his answer to this, which is significant for some of the other points that have been brought up, he says, if freedom means anything, it calls for diversity in unity, which is fascinating because it's the same language that's actually being used by a major international project right now, right? Diversity in unity. And he says there would be greater and deeper unity in Jewish life if every Jew could observe Seder with a Haggadah entirely his own, right? So he's actually encouraging what we have now, which is the production of new Haggadot for all of our households. There's fourth out of the 5 main arguments that he's sharing in his journals that he's often hearing, is that, and this is about election, chosenness, the repudiation of the traditional doctrine of Israel's election is a greater departure from normative Judaism than even the reformist omission of Zion from their Haggadah. In answer, I developed some of the ideas which I am at present trying to formulate concerning the doctrine of Israel's election, which we see lots of other places. And then the 5th is that the recital of the Haggadah is intended to create a mood and not to be taken too literally, right? So Kaplan's concerns that, as we saw in the journal, that he really needs to like take this cancerous growth of these things that people don't really believe out of the Haggadah. The argument back is, don't worry, nobody takes them literally anyway. I'll pause there. We're already after the hour.
So
and take it back.
Professor Saracen is sharing some interesting, for those on the Zoom meeting, some interesting comments in Zoom already. I'd love to call on him at the risk of putting him on the spot for a minute to talk about the reception of the first Union Haggadah, the Reform Haggadah, as I was asking him about yesterday, 1906-1907, or just afterwards. So let me make sure he is unmuted. Oh, come on.
Okay.
Rick, are you on?
Yeah. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. What is interesting, what is even more interesting, and you see this in the pages of the CCAR yearbook, is that even is while they are working on this first Union Haggadah, there is a whole range of opinions here. This relates also to what I put up there about the inconsistency in modernist liturgies. There are people who are more radical. There are people who are less radical, even within the reform movement of the early 1900s. There
Until
are people,
today.
and it's still the case today. But I mean, but we tend to caricature the reformers of the 1880s, 90s, and 1900s as all radicals. They weren't. That was only a particular group. And so there was, a lot of backing and forthing about how much is taken out, how much is left in, how much, if you will, feels Jewish about this. And that's why often things are left in that are theologically inconsistent, because people have emotional attachments to them, musical attachments to them, popular attachments to them, and if one speaks, if you will, with Schechter about Catholic Israel with a small c, that is to say, Klal Yisrael, you're going to leave things in because that's what people are accustomed to. That's what feels Jewish. And this happens in Reform circles too. I think the difference here, and this is something that both Dan and Rachel have pointed out, is that Kaplan is doing innovations, some of which, as Rachel points out, have been around for a long time in the Reform camp, but he is doing this for a more centrist camp, out of the conservative movement, where these things have not been put out there to the same extent, and in which context they are far more radical than they would be in a Reform context by this point. So the kinds of attacks that he is getting are coming from the center and from the right of center. The kinds of responses, I would say, to the initial Union Haggadah, by that time, to some extent, in 1906, the American Jewish community, to some extent, had already split sociologically into denominations, and so sometimes people on the right wouldn't even be looking at this stuff. So you wouldn't get the same kind of harsh criticisms as, say, the Hamburg Prayer Book would in 1819 or 1842, where the community was still a little bit more together. The issue of criticism is very much a sociological issue. That is to say, where is this coming from, and whose ox is being gored, if you will, and why are people, and which people are responding so strongly here.
Thank you. In the interest of time, because I know they're under very reasonable time constraints, Rabbis Levitt and Strausfeld are now going to get the floor to respond a little more generally. And this may be a little bit out of order to from their perspective as the editors of the 2000. Really, what I want to claim, and you can argue with me, obviously, is the first really new Reconstructionist Haggadah. That is, there is a substantially revised second edition from 1978. And there remains today in print at Behrman House, as you probably know, something called now the New American Haggadah, that I have not figured out yet to who added the word American, but they did. But yours, I think, is the first substantially different Reconstructionist Haggadah. So the floor is open to either, both of you. What you wanted to preserve, what you wanted to change. Let me just make sure you're unmuted. Well, one sec.
Okay.
It should be on. There you go.
I mean, one thing I'd really like to know about that second edition, and Mel may have the answer to this question. We were told that Ludwig Nadelman reinserted the plagues literally on the way to the publishing house, that it had not been agreed upon, and that somehow it got snuck in the 11th hour. I don't know if that's true, Mel, or if anybody has heard this before.
Yeah, I do know this because Rabbi Nadelman of blessed memory was my rabbi, my parents' rabbi. He certainly had a lot to do with it, whether it was without, and I just noticed, I just flipped through the introduction. I don't think he's really acknowledged. I take it for granted that he's there because I heard him lead Seders and other things from it, but I'm sure I believe he did it. The question is, let me unmute Mel, who knew about it. Mel, do you know?
No, not sure.
No.
Not sure, yeah. Anyway, it is interesting that particular thing got put back, and as I understand, it was just that, and I think it was, kind of a marketing thing. Like by that point, no one could really imagine a Seder without plagues, so they weren't going to sell. It wasn't going to sell if it didn't have, at least that touchstone. Yeah, that one. Okay.
So any thoughts you want to share before you go about what did you want to keep, what did you want to change, to what extent was it in your mind as you were working?
Well, that famous comment, now you'll tell me, about the rabbi who was accused by his congregants of not following in the footsteps of his father. Who is it?
Well, it's an apocryphal.
Oh,
whatever.
It's apocryphal. Well, we all quote it, right?
Quotes.
And he said, no, I do exactly what my father did. He didn't do what his father did, and I don't do what my father did.
I always heard it quoted by Simcha Bunam, Michael, but
I'm going to go with you, Rachel.
That's what I got.
I mean,
but he quoted somebody else for sure.
Every non-Orthodox Jew quotes this, but I think we very much were respectful about the 41 prayer book Haggadah, in the sense that we understood that it was a Haggadah for its time, and it was willing to make radical change, and the changes that we made were different. I can talk a little bit about some of the fights we had. Michael reminded me of one that we lost in the prayer book commission.
Oh, I thought you meant between you and.
Well, we'd happily talk about that. We'd been like stuck in the house together for a month. So there were, I mean, it was interesting. Obviously, the process was really different, right? There was a whole prayer book commission. It wasn't three men sitting in a room making decisions, or four. It was really movement wide, and it had to go through a lot of process. So we didn't always get what we wanted. But I think to Jeffrey's earlier point, we were very, very mindful of the pedagogy here, particularly the pedagogy of questions. So one of the innovative parts of the Seder, of the Haggadah, was that we retained this idea that we were going to tell the story. Instead of writing it, we lifted sections from the Exodus story itself. But per a suggestion by Dr. Lori Lefkowitz, we brought the children in to ask questions throughout that section. And that actually turned out to be really popular, more popular, I think, than the actual Magid of reading from Exodus, which I think was much less successful in our Haggadah. It was just too much. But we were very conscious of that issue of pedagogy when we were thinking about it. I don't know if you want to
And I think one of the insights we tried to bring to it is trying to uncover the structure of the pedagogy of the Haggadah, which had been over the centuries had been became obscured by additions. And just you take a section like Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer, Pesach Matzah and more. Rabban Gamliel wasn't saying repeat exactly what I'm saying. Matzah, it means this. He was saying you have to explain these symbols. These are critical symbols, right? Or another obvious example, that there is no reason that in traditional Haggadot you do the 4-cup and you have Nirtzah and then you sing all the songs. It's because the songs were added later, right? And so someone didn't feel we could add it into what was the traditional Haggadah.
I thought it was because the singing is better if you have that 4th cup of wine.
Definitely. But it's the idea, it's sort of that it should end with the ending, right? And with the Shana Haba, not with Chad Gadya or anything else. So there's some obvious changes, but I think ultimately the challenge was similar to Kaplan's and very different because it was a different time, which was how to make, as Rachel said, here is the one significant piece of liturgy that's done at home, and without a rabbi, a cantor, or whatever. And how to make that work. And I think one of the things that I don't know if Kaplan was aware of this. I think in some ways he was focused on these big theological issues. We were also very focused on the disparate nature of people's seders, that there are people with no background, there are non-Jews, there are people with, who just want to say the traditional thing, as well as how do you keep people of different ages, particularly young children and children with older people, in the same space, in the same experience.
I think we were as much reacting to the Maxwell House Haggadah as we were to the 41 Kaplan Haggadah, in the sense that we knew that lots and lots of otherwise very intelligent people, including my own family, were using the Maxwell House Haggadah because it was free. I still remember it was probably like 1962 or 3 when our family finally got one Haggadah that was the same. and it was the Maxwell House Haggadah. My father knew what to do. You know, he didn't have a vast Jewish education, and he saw where it said leader and he knew what to do. And so for years and years, we used that Haggadah, even though it was really, you know, both way too traditional for our family. It wasn't thoughtful in a lot of ways, but it worked. And the first time I disrupted that in our family, and I did one of those cut and paste Haggadahs, everybody fell apart. The Seder was terrible because my father didn't really know what to do. So I think we were very conscious that we wanted something to work, and those periwinkle pages that were in the front or in the back, depending on which edition of this Haggadah you're using, in which we basically curated 4 different Seders for people. One called More is More for people that were willing to go through the whole thing. Less is More, really for families. A feminist Seder, we were all, and a Seder that would really identify those universal aspects of the Haggadah that would be helpful for people where there were lots of people that weren't Jewish at the Seder. You know, for us was like really, really critical. We also, I think, were reacting somewhat negatively, and I'm not sure how I feel about this right now, but we were reacting somewhat negatively to these children's Haggadahs that were very prevalent, because we noticed that families were using them and then not switching, not graduating from them, because the tradition of using the same Haggadah was so important. And yet they were pretty juvenile for teenagers. So we kind of hoped that this Seder could grow with families.
Great. I don't mean to interrupt. Thank you. Rachel herself is under some time pressure, so I want her to finish the material she's got planned. I assume you will take questions that aren't asked today by email.
Of course, no, thank you.
But why don't you go ahead and get to whatever other material you want to make sure to cover right now, and then I'll continue with whoever would like to stay on. We have some interesting comments and questions. We have some real experts, you know, with us. No, not our primary presenter at that point, but we have some other experts with us for some of the questions that are actually more technical also, I think. I will just say for Michael and Joy before you go, thank you. But also, in case you haven't seen it, our friend Rabbi Fred Sherlander-Dobb has sent you a lovely tribute in the chat bar. So.
Thank you.
Listen, if we can't have a Kaplan Center conference right now, this is really the next best thing to be with, especially as a treat before Pesach, to be with all of you. So many of you, Joy, Michael, Rick, Mel, you're all, you know, my teachers, and Eric, you're certainly such a model colleague in this field. It's such an honor to be with all of you and many more whose names I probably can't see. Lots of colleagues I know are on this. So what an honor, and what a great way to, what can I say, soon after we finish a bunch of sessions in the next few days, and unfortunately various funerals and shivas online. I hope that we can all take the inspiration of this session with us into Pesach. I want to make sure that we touch upon at least one example of how Kaplan, and with this maybe we can conclude this in one other thing. I want to make sure that we touch upon just one example of a reading that I think is so characteristic of one of the ways in which Kaplan approached the idea of freedom in this new Haggadah. But the freedom we strive for, this is after, you know, talks about freedom for all mankind, et cetera, and the Yetziat Mitzrayim, but the freedom we strive for means more than broken chains. It means liberation from all those enslavements that warp the spirit and blight the mind, that destroy the soul, even though they leave the flesh alive. For men can be enslaved in more ways than one. Men can be enslaved to themselves when they let emotions sway them to their hurt, when they permit harmful habits to tyrannize them harmful habits to tyrannize over them, they are slaves. When laziness or cowardice keeps them from doing what they know to be the right, when ignorance blinds them, when envy, bitterness, and jealousy sour their joys and darken the brightness of their contentment, right? They are slaves to themselves and shackled by their own forging. And I think that is such a powerful example of the ways in which Kaplan, in all his liturgy and writing, is really seeking for this ultimate idea of the ways in which Judaism can bring us toward a greater self-actualization. And that in America, he saw America as the place in which we could have the greatest actualization. And then, of course, in a sovereign Jewish state. So I want to end actually with a new insert that's actually being shared as we speak with thousands and thousands of Jews all over the world in 5 different languages. And the reason I want to share it is actually because I'm the primary author of it. And also because I believe, and I think you'll see it is very Keplanian. It's Keplanian also in the sense, hopefully you can see this. Yes. Let me see. Did you see what I just opened up? Yes, hopefully.
Right now I've got you. Yes, there you go.
Okay. So this is not the final way that it's obviously being produced in 5 languages, but it's part of a new endeavor called Our Common Destiny that's funded by the Genesis Philanthropy Group and the Ministry of the State of Israel. And it was actually launched, we launched it with the President of Israel, Ruvi Rivlin, in September. And we'll be doing this it's basically the project is crowdsourcing world Jewry about 5 major principles. But one of the things that we created was this new insert for your Haggadah, which I'll share with you as a closing meditation. As we hold up the matzah this year, this is the bread of our affliction, halach ma'anya. This is our shared story of suffering and freedom. As we hold the matzah this year, whether with our families or completely alone, may we experience our connection to the story of the Jewish people, to our values and to our shared future. As we partake in this bread of memory and hope, may we never forget our Exodus story and our promise to ourselves that even in our new, more limited freedom, we will not stand by when others are suffering. Let all who are in need know that we are with them. As we ready ourselves to eat this hard bread of affliction, let us also prepare ourselves to respond to the suffering and isolation all around the globe. May all who are suffering, whether they are sick, afraid, hungry, suffering from domestic violence or any other plague, know that we see you, we hear you, and we will work together to respond to you. May all who are mourning find comfort, and may we collectively find ways to console them. May we continue to support medical personnel as well as all service workers who are responding with all their capacities, generosity, care, and self-sacrifice. May all who are suffering now be healed quickly. May all who are in need know that the Jewish people will respond with the best of ourselves. May we find new ways to learn about each other and to learn together, even virtually. Let us assure each other that we, the Jewish people, share a common destiny and we will create it together. May we look into the eyes of those around us and those who we see from afar and assure each other that we are mutually responsible for one another, for the health and safety and spiritual well-being of ourselves, our communities, and for all of humanity today as we were then. This year we are here, we are broken apart, but next year may we find new beginnings, a new commitment to each other, a new wholeness, and a new common destiny.
Amen.
Amen.
So Professor Saracen at least has asked for you to share these documents as soon as they're, and I'm sure we'd all love to see them whenever they're public. So you, with that, we're not going to end right now because there are some questions. Mel Skull has a comment. I'm going to excuse anybody, obviously, who needs to leave. Not that I need to do that, including first and foremost with our great thanks and a hearty, as they say, Yishar Kochech to Rabbi Dr. Rachel Sabbath Beit Halachmi for this wonderful presentation. And then, as people stay or go, we'll wish you, obviously, Chag Kasher v'Sameach, however you read that. I'll just say, have a sweet and liberating Pesach. So again, people, no formal ending yet, but please feel free to exit the room quietly as you leave. Mel, you had a comment as we begin to wrap up. Oops, hold on, Mel, you need to unmute yourself. No, somebody is fighting with me. Okay,
yeah.
Now.
I want to highlight and emphasize the notion of Passover as the celebration of freedom, which is so central to the Haggadah. What I would like to say is that it was revolutionary. The point is that in the traditional Haggadah, we have the expression Yad Chazaka Uvizro Netuya. In other words, the traditional meaning of Passover is the celebration of God's power. And the element of freedom is there, of course, but it's not as central as Kaplan makes it. And we take that emphasis on freedom for granted. And I would like to say that that is a revolution in terms of the meaning of Passover, and that it comes from Kaplan. A few minor, very minor points you mentioned, Rachel. Are you still there?
Yeah.
Yeah. This meeting with the faculty, it lasted 2 hours. They put Kaplan on the carpet. He had nobody to support them. And then he went down to the shore. I think Miriam was probably there in Long Branch. And Ira advocated that they leave the seminary and that they establish a new movement. I'd like to end my comments with a quotation from the Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion, which is really a sort of knock your socks off. It comes from a statement about Passover. And what Kaplan says is the following, and this we need this so deeply. The God impulse in us is not fear, but hope, not helplessness, but self-help, not despondency, but courage, not obfuscation of the mind, but the light of reason, not belittlement of what man is, but the exaltation of what he might be. And I keep that in my mind in this very, very difficult time. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have one a good technical question. Professor Saracen's already sort of responded indirectly, at least in the chat section, and that is about what Rachel read about Chancellor Rabbi Finkelstein's critique of Kaplan for not doing Agadah or Haggadah, as he might have said. As Rabbi Saracen said, many people would say, no, Midrash is interpretation. I think to some extent, I would suggest as an amateur that it's a little loose rhetorical device here. Famously in the, I don't know if it's in the Haggadah letter, the later Siddur letter, Ginsburg, Marx, and Lieberman tell Kaplan to, quote, stick to Agadah, meaning that's his failed, because it was, and Midrash, but that he is messing really here with the opposite, with halacha, and that what he's really concerned about is that it may be, I'm just guessing, it may be sort of almost a playful rendering of Haggadah and Agadah, but what he's really talking about is restructuring what he views as a halachic ordering, right, of the Seder, I think. Eric, you've got one or more things to add, as always, which would be great. You can unmute. I'm trying to unmute you. You may need to help. The unmute function, I don't know why it doesn't.
Okay, I think I've unmuted. Just two quick comments. I gave more thought in the run up to this session than I think had done before about how the attack that he got, that vicious attack that that you pointed out, Rachel, and Mel mentioned again, how it affected what came next. So if you take a look at that attack, two parts of the attack are kind of interesting. One is that they critique him for giving an English translation, which is not always literal. And then second of all, which is funny in light of what the conservative movement landed up doing, when they started publishing liturgies. And then secondly, they critique him for being inconsistent in the changes. One idea is removed in one place, but it's kept in another place. And if you take a look at, if you compare the new Haggadah to the 45 Siddur, so the 45 Siddur, the 45 prayer book is very careful to have a literal translation, where the two sides of the page add up. And second of all, he is more consistent, right? So, those of you who remember the 45 Siddur, he actually rewrites the parts in Lecha Dodi that are problematic theologically. He rewrites, Ein Kilohenu. And I can't help but wonder if, part of that difference between the 41 liturgy and the 45 liturgy is somehow, an overall response to the attacks that he got, and it how it impacted him. The other statement that I just wanted to make is that going through the newer Reconstructionist Haggadah, one thing that really, they're beyond kind of a theological commonality. They're very, very different texts, but one aspect of the difference that really stood out for me, which is that both of the texts speak in a very, very strong social justice voice. In the Kaplan Haggadah, right, there's all those, beyond all the English readings that Rachel pointed out, there's, all the quotations about all the times, that the Exodus is mentioned basically to impart a moral message. And then in A Night of Questions, so much of the commentary places social justice right at the forefront, and almost every commentary by Rabbi Tova Spitzer and multiple other things. But one of the things that stood out for me is that the new Reconstructionist one is kind of written from the perspective of a Jewish community that has privilege, and how is this community going to use its privilege to the benefit of society as a whole? Well, the 41 Haggadah is definitely written from the perspective of the Jews as part of a community of the oppressed, and to me, it makes for a very different type of reading experience. And I couldn't help but wonder whether, from a liturgical standpoint, even if we are a community that has much more privilege than we did 70, 80 years ago, liturgically approaching it in the more Kaplanian voice might be more powerful.
Eric, let me ask you, as to the first part of your remarks, do you think it would be fair to call ironic the fact that the 1946 so-called Silverman Siddur, rushed into print to counter the Reconstructionist Siddur, is famous for the lack of consistency between the Hebrew and the English?
Yeah, the whole response that the JTS faculty writes to him, I just really still can't get over the fact that they feel like they had to tell him that karpas is not parsley, but it's celery. That is just like so ridiculous and petty. But on the other hand, you see that if you compare the revised edition from 42 to the one that came out in 41, so he does change the mistake that he'd made with getting the wrong Ramban Gamliel, and he tries to address one of the points that they made about the non-alignment of the English and the Hebrew. So in Adir Hu, right, where it has the reference to Yivne Veto, beforehand they didn't have it as his temple. Now they've returned it as his temple, but they have a footnote that says temple means land of Israel. But he didn't do anything about the karpas, which I think is fantastic, because he would have made that kind of really such a silly little comment to make. I'm glad that he thought that wasn't worth dealing with.
Joy or Michael, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I was struck by that last comment, and it is. The difference in the economic situation of the Jewish community in 41 and today, and if you're privileged, often you don't think you're privileged, just because it's just the way it is. But one thing I wanted to say is I may not see it that way, but I felt that one of the things that we did, which I think was to Kaplan's credit and was just referred to, is that he actually changed the liturgy. He rewrote the Hebrew. And too often, not only is it a question of, is that really the translation? But I think in the struggle with new prayers, one of the challenges when the prayer's in English, that it feels, very, it doesn't feel like it's rooted in the tradition. And so there was one place, and one place, there were a couple places, but one place in particular where we wrote new Hebrew liturgy in the Haggadah, which picked up on the Lefichach anachnu chayvim lahodot lahalel, etc. when you're coming to the second cup, but instead we wrote a new paragraph. Lefichach anachnu chayvim laavod litzok lishtadel ba'ad gulat yoshvei tevel. Right, so it's a call to engage in social justice, and whether that's coming from a place of privilege or just coming from a call to social justice, I'll leave each of us to figure out. But it's an explicit, and I wanted to mention it earlier because it really roots it in Hebrew liturgy and taking parts of liturgy, writing a new prayer, and to give current expression so that it feels. And one person once turned to me at the Seder and said, "This is a great, how come I've never seen this prayer before?" And I said, well, because we just wrote it.
And by we, Michael means Michael wrote it, just so that it was a shame I'm Roe here.
Whichever. But I think that also is part of the challenge of liturgy, and part of the radical nature of Kaplan, that there was a lot, and not only stuff that was because it was related to chosenness and not chosen. There was a lot of new Hebrew in the prayer book.
And this is a complete aside, and Michael probably would prefer I not share it, but the way that you know that when you write it in Hebrew, people think it's real and it's traditional. In the precursor of the conservative Haggadah that first appeared as an issue of conservative Judaism that Michael had written, there was rewriting of a considerable amount of Hebrew that then found its way into Jonathan Safran Foer's American Haggadah without any accreditation, because they thought it was the quote unquote traditional. And in fact, if you go take a look at it, it is neither traditional nor credited to Michael. And the RA didn't actually realize it, but since we're among friends here, I thought I would share that. The only other thing is that I alluded earlier to a fight that we had, and nobody picked up on it, but I thought you should know that we wanted to reinsert Shvo Chamadcha. In this way, I suppose we're coming at in the Alan Miller school of you never know when you're going to need it theory. And for us, it did feel like enemies abounded, and that could be reconstructed, but we were overruled.
Yeah, and on that point, I'm always, you're probably well familiar with it, but one of the Hartman Haggadot, speaking of one of Rachel's former positions, adds, and I think this is well known, they put in, because it's very traditional in many ways in terms of the Hebrew text, so they have Shvo Chamadcha, but then they add Shvo Achavatcha,
yes,
which is a medieval piece that they didn't write, the Noam Sion, that they found in a medieval text attributed, I think, to Rashi or his descendants.
Yeah, we've never been able to
No,
find it.
that's actually, it's not.
That's an urban legend.
True.
Well, it's a lovely text. At any
it's like anything on the internet. If it sounds too good to be
well, they
true,
put it in print.
oh.
I've got it in front of me. I want to just touch on one other thing. I'm still looking for questions. And this is for Professor Saracen primarily. I want to introduce it this way. So I'm, as may be obvious, always fascinated by denominationalism in these things, or sectarianism, if you will. So what I'm curious about, and maybe you want to comment generally, or maybe from the Reform perspective particularly, is I'm never sure whether some of the controversies we're talking about today for both Kaplan's Haggadah and the 45 Siddur are more about the fraying relationship between orthodoxy and the non-Orthodox, particularly within what we call the conservative movement that was more or less co-ed, certainly in the 40s, or whether they're really largely about internal struggles to define conservative Judaism, which, as I just said, I think is becoming, but not quite fully, co-ed in the mid 40s. And we also hear, of course, when we get to the excommunication, which should be a subject for a whole other meeting, have the question of a dispute within Orthodoxy, because the Union of Orthodox Rabbis of United States and Canada, or as they like to be called, I suppose properly, the Agudas HaRabbanim, are struggling for their own authority because they are losing out to modern and centrist segments of Orthodoxy, and they're trying to say, we matter. So I'd love your thoughts on that, and also back to the, I think you touched on this a little, but I remain fascinated also by how Kaplan draws down, I know you answered this in terms of context, but Kaplan draws down the wrath of people in a way that he would acknowledge very important radical reformists of liturgy, namely within the capital R reform movement, do not. So the question becomes, why not burn Minhag America, or why not burn the Union prayer book? I'd be curious to hear you on that.
Sure. Okay, the two parts. In the first part, I would say yes to everything that you said, Dan. I think all of those things are going on simultaneously in terms of what was going on there. This is a case where it's not simply one factor. And I think that also relates to some extent to the why Kaplan was so vilified, in part because Kaplan had very good Orthodox credentials in terms of where he came from, and then he yatsa letarbut ra'a, as far as some folks were concerned. I think you always lash out more strongly and feel more threatened by somebody who's closer to you. It's partly the family dynamic, if you will. There were, again in the 19th century, there was certainly a lot of criticism from Leeser and criticism from, the Treifa banquet and what, sort of what broke, one of several factors that broke Wise's goal of a united Minhag America, which really was never going to happen anyways. But I would say, again, most of that stuff within the reform movement happened in the 19th century. Whereas what was happening again in the 20s, 30s, and 40s of the 20th century was precisely, as you point out, some of these identity issues within the conservative movement, and even more broadly, I would say, within the Eastern European portion of the American Jewish community, and how it was sort of segmenting out. And again, there were portions of the conservative movement that were strongly allied with traditional Judaism. Again, at the seminary, think of people like Lieberman and Finkelstein, and others, and particularly the next generation, who again were more interested in something that was more American. And Kaplan identified certainly with and that group identified with Kaplan. I should point out, by the way, that Kaplan was very, very influential among a number of Reform rabbis in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and beyond. So again, Kaplan is remembered in some respects as the one who Agudat Yisrael went out and spat on the Siddur and so on and so forth. But Kaplan was a model for many in the Reform rabbinate, who identified heavily with that kind of interpretation, non-supernaturalist interpretation of Judaism as a civilization. So it depends on the perspective that you're looking from.
Yep. Any closing thought? Thank you. I think we've got all the questions. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful, joyous Pesach to be continued.
Sameach.
Pesach Sameach.
Thank you so much.
Pesach
Sameach, everybody.
Sameach.
Bye, Sameach.